The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, after another abysmal voter turnout in Ontario, does voting even matter anymore? Then, Paralympian athlete Jason Dunkerley shares his remarkable story of running against the odds. That's next on The Agenda. The results of Ontario's 44th general election show less than half of registered voters chose to exercise their franchise. With such a poor turnout, at what point do elections reflect the will of the people? And to what extent can we re-energize democracy in Ontario? Let's discuss with Karim Bardisi. He is Executive Director of the DAIS at Toronto Metropolitan University. Sonal Champsy, Director at Not One Seat, a progressive grassroots organization. Nelson Wiseman, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and Martin Regcon, political columnist for the Toronto Star. And it's great to have you four here in our studio for our first post-election program, I guess. And it's sad. We're going to start with some sad numbers. Sheldon, you want to bring these up right off the top here? In 2022, we had about 10.7 million people registered to vote. It was more this time, over 11 million. The number of people who actually voted in 2022 was 4.7 million. A little higher this time in 2025, just over 5 million. But the turnout, boy, when I was a kid, we had turnout in the 70s and the 80s. In 2022, it was just over 44%, and this time it was just over 45%. Okay, let's weigh in on this. MRC, what do those numbers tell you?
Well, let's first set the stage, which is that this was a no surprises election. It was like a Holiday Inn election, not in thunder.
Best surprise is no surprise.
Yeah. So it was not a change election. It was a more of the same election, and it was an election in many ways about nothing. And so the turnout flows from that. Political scientists will tell you that when there's a change election, you tend to get a really bit of a kick in the turnout. Because this was a no surprises election, the turnout was at our new equilibrium of below 50%. That said, so the surprise was that it wasn't as bad as most of us thought it would be. I think some of us I thought it might be below 40%. And it was at 45 and a little bit in the middle of winter. So not that bad.
Sonal, what did you think of those numbers?
I mean, I think the fact that it was at 45, shows that, people were motivated to kind of come out much more than we would have thought, especially, in a terrible February. But I think people are disengaged. And I think a lot of that is, you're right, it wasn't a change election, but at the same time, the opposition, decided to play games and fight for second place. And I think when, the opposition parties show that they don't care about voters, why would voters care about them to get them out?
That speaks to what your organization is all about, which we'll come back to a little bit later. Karim, what did you think of the numbers?
Somewhat higher turnout that surprised a bunch of us is still pretty faint praise. And there are a bunch of reasons why turnout is consistently low. And you can look at the political parties, you can look at the electoral system, but I think we have some fundamentally deeper issues with our democracy that we'll need to dive into, especially in Ontario, especially at a time when it feels like the stakes are, for a lot of people, are very high. And so we have some work to do. All the elite institutions that are supposed to be driving people to the polls or getting people excited about democracy, they're not succeeding in doing that.
We shall dive into those reasons during the course of our discussion. Nelson Wiseman.
I'm a contrarian. I don't think low turnout is the big issue that many people make it out to be. And I don't think it's a threat to Canadian democracy, because I think democracy is a much broader spectrum of factors and institutions like courts, the operation of legislatures, of free and independent media, those things. About this specific turnout, I did notice that commentators were expecting a lower turnout. I wasn't sure. I thought it would be around what it was because it was consistent with last time. I agree about the winter. Steve, you mentioned when turnouts were in the 70s and 80s. I don't recall when they were that high in Ontario. And if you compare Ontario to other provinces, you'll see Ontario and Alberta is breaking away from it now, have consistently had lower turnouts than in other provinces.
Why should we, I mean, okay, be the contrarian, I like that, but why should we not be mortified by the fact that more than half the people don't want to vote?
What it tells me is that a lot of people think it either doesn't matter who you vote for, or that the quality of their life is not going to change significantly. And this speaks to the idea of change. If they think really big issues are at play and they want to get rid of somebody, as a lot wanted to get rid of Trudeau, you'll get a higher turnout. As a lot wanted to get rid of Harper, you'll get higher turnout. But otherwise, voter participation has trended down, I'd say, since the 50s.
Yeah. But I think too that, I mean, if I think there were a lot of important issues in this election. I think, Ontario is in crisis in many ways. I mean, there's millions of people without a family doctor. The homelessness issue is much higher. Public education is crumbling. Our secondary schools are being underfunded. Lots of programs have to be canceled. So there were big issues, but I think to what you're saying, it's like people didn't think any of it was going to change, because if you're going to vote for, and I mean, yes, this is what my organization is about, but if you're going to vote for change and no one's offering any, or no one's offering a path towards successfully changing anything, like, why go out and vote at all?
Let me pick up on that with Martin. You had 3 of the 4 major party leaders come to TMU to do your democracy forum. Could you infer that people didn't show up to vote in the numbers that they used to because they just didn't believe that the opposition leaders would be any better than the guy who's in there now?
I think that's true. I think people believe that. I think many of the people that perhaps you talk to or you interact with believe that the province is in crisis too. So there are all kinds of belief sets. Without trying to get too abstract here, it's hard to extrapolate from ourselves. I think if people really thought the province was in crisis, they would have turned out in bigger numbers. So I think, to be fair, in relative terms, the province isn't in a huge crisis. I would say that Ontario did have a big turnout in 2018 because that was a change election. It went back above 50%. I think it was 57% or so, to get rid of Kathleen Wynne, to throw the bums out. Forgive me, Ms. Wynne. But in Alberta, one of the reasons, Nelson, that you're right, that election turnouts are so low in Alberta is that for the longest time, even today, it was a one-party state. I don't mean that in a North Korean way, but there was no significant opposition. Steve, just to answer your question, though, I do think some of the opposition parties do offer pathways to change. They just aren't able to connect with voters.
Well, yeah, and I think they can't connect with voters, and they can't simply because, like, it didn't look like anyone was going to win. I mean, both the Liberals and the NDP, and of course the Green Party were, very low in the polls. I mean, no one expects the Green Party to win from 2 seats. Let's be realistic, but they're very down in the polls. They're not. None of the 3 parties were offering anything interesting or anything very different from one another. And I think everyone knew from the outset that the vote was going to split. And yet none of the opposition leaders decided to do anything about vote splitting.
Let me pick up, okay, I'm going to come to that later. I want to pick up on the polling angle here. And to that end, Sheldon, can I get you to bring up stat board number 2 here, how people voted? We want to compare essentially how people voted in this election compared to 2022. 2.5 years ago. The Progressive Conservatives in the previous election got almost 41% of the vote. They got almost 43% of the vote this time. The New Democrats, they went down quite a bit, actually. They went from 23.74 down to below 19%. Still managed to be official opposition, though. The Liberals, almost the exact same vote as the NDP in the last election. They actually went up a lot this time, but didn't get very many more seats for all of their troubles. And the Greens lost about a point and change. And there's Bobby Ann Brady at the bottom. Boy, she represented 60% of all the independent votes that took place there. I guess one of the okay, a bunch of points to make here. Cream, let me go with you first on this. The polls during this election campaign barely moved at all. I mean, really didn't move at all. It was Conservatives in first by a lot all the way through. NDP and Liberals sort of fighting for second, and then it sort of clarified itself. Greens down there in last. I don't know how many voters I talked to who said, why am I going to bother voting? I know who's going to win. Polls haven't moved. I don't care who comes second. So why should we get out there? How much of a factor is that?
Yeah, I think that's a real thing. One of the things that this Conservative Party has succeeded in doing, and whenever we have a party that sort of dominates one ideological space and you've got a split on the other side is the progressive conservatives in Ontario have done a really good job at this, of kind of keeping the opposition parties equal so that one isn't too far ahead of the other, and they can do that by doing regional attacks. They can pick issues that kind of have the parties fighting with each other. So I think that's a real thing. If voters, they experience this individually as well. At the dais, we do a lot of work with students. We had a project with an organization called the Democratic Engagement Exchange to do voter mobilization on campuses across Ontario with Elections Ontario. And, you have to go where people are and actually show them what it means to actually cast your ballot. You actually have to show them that this is what's happening, this is the broader system, and you can have a voice. Now, does that voice mean a change in government? Doesn't that, not necessarily. Does that voice mean that you can have some form of representation? Maybe yes. I mean, you mentioned Bobby Ann Brady. Those voters in Haldeman, Norfolk knew that they were not going to get a government member, or for that matter, an opposition party member, but they felt some identification with that, with Ms. Brady. Political entrepreneurs, politicians who are working hard to do politics a bit differently or using media differently can cut through. Sometimes the party leadership is a bit more cautious in that respect. That's the other, I think, lesson from this, that when opposition parties take chances and break a bit out of their bubbles about the way they think politics needs to work, that's one way of gaining vote and gaining attention.
But Nelson, I want to ask you about this, because media think they are doing a service to the public by letting them know what the state of play is pretty much every day. Here's what the polls say your voter intention is today. And, pretty much every day of the campaign, you've got somebody putting new numbers out there. We think we are doing a service to the electorate by doing that because we're giving them information. Can it have the opposite effect of saying, this thing's a fait accompli, it's a foregone conclusion, you don't need to vote?
Well, I think political junkies knew that, but a lot of the public just doesn't tune into politics. They're watching the Food Channel. They're not watching the Agenda or the Golf Channel, and they've got to go pick up their kids. Their concerns are their daily life. I think it's also helpful to put Ontario again in comparative perspective. Ontarians historically have been more oriented to federal politics than provincial politics. There could be various reasons, including the fact that Ontario has a disproportionate number of immigrants and recent arrivals. But there's also the fact, and I grew up in Manitoba, is that in Manitoba, provincial politics are covered in the local media. Here, I can read the Globe and Mail maybe for 3-4 years before I run into the name of a backbencher. I'll run into the names of the leaders and the premier, of course, but that's inconceivable in Nova Scotia. So, and when you're outside of Ontario, the center of the country, you're much more sensitive to the fact that you're not in the center. And Ontarians think, oh yeah, what politics is about is what's going on federally. And my whole experience as an immigrant has been living in Ontario.
Kareem.
Where voters get their information from is so crucial. Just to pick up on Professor Wiseman's point, I survey my students every semester about where they get their information. And there's a good engaged subset of students who go to TVO, who go to the Agenda, go to other kind of what you might call more trusted news platforms, the Star, the Globe and Mail, CTV and CBC. The two most common sources, and this is somewhat scientific, and we also have some DAIS research that's more scientific. The DAIS research shows that Instagram and YouTube are among the most common sources for news. TV news, though, is still quite high. But within those kind of online platforms, the ones that come up for my students are CP24 on the one hand, very straight news, and 6Buzz.
What is that?
6Buzz is a kind of a flashy, newsy website that just takes little pictures, little pieces of news that are happening out there and kind of throws them online. It might have some, viral videos about some crime happening in the GTA, what a celebrity is doing. But then they'll throw up, Justin Trudeau, Doug Ford, Bonnie Crombie, Marit Stiles, and Mike Schreiner. There's no context to this news, and it's just people are scrolling through it. And so, Media and politics are fusing like never before, but the kinds of sources of media that people are getting are just not conducive to that depth of engagement.
Martin, I want your take on whether or not your attempt to inform the electorate as to the state of play in an election has a perverse effect of having people not show up to vote because when one party's in first place by a big margin throughout the whole writ period, people think it's a foregone conclusion.
When you said perverse, I suddenly felt guilty and like j'accuse. But I think I would agree with you that it does have, it can have a discouraging effect. That's just fair. That's the truth. That doesn't mean any of us, and nor would you suggest, should suppress that perversity. I think Sonal would argue that those polling numbers could actually help people decide how to vote strategically for that relatively small number of people who do vote strategically, because most people don't. But just my point is that I think polling it can actually help people if it's a close election, if the numbers were closer. So let's not blame the perverse pollsters. I'm talking to him today. I'm going to call him perverse. That if it's a close election, those polling numbers can actually encourage people to vote. So that's just the way the ball
Let's explain what your group is all about, because you're in the strategic voting realm, right?
Yeah, we are. Ideally what we would love to see is electoral cooperation, so have the parties work together as a united front against Doug Ford. But we knew from the outset that is a really difficult task. So then the next best option for us, because our focus is Doug Ford. Our next best option was to try to unite the public to vote strategically. And we weren't the only people doing this. There was a huge movement on TikTok for smartvoting.ca. VoteWell was big. There was a lot of talk about strategic voting. And there was a Nanos poll just before the election that showed that 3 in 10 Ontarians were intended to vote strategically. So I don't think it's a minority of people. It's a plurality, certainly.
I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but I think strategic voting, if strategic voting was as effective as some of us would like it to be, you would have seen a much different result.
I don't think strategic voting is enormously effective. I think it is a last-ditch attempt to do something because there is no other option.
So how would you like to see the so-called three progressive parties cooperating more in order to take down Doug Ford?
I think what a lot of people wanted to see, and we have an open letter up on our website right now, and we've had a number of people hundreds of people have signed it so far, and almost all of them have been writing comments, which is interesting because I didn't expect this much comments, but almost everybody is so angry that the parties didn't field candidates strategically, why is the NDP out in Scarborough, where they don't get a lot of attention, except for Scarborough Southwest or in Etobicoke, where they don't get a lot of votes.
Let me give a concrete example here. If you go to Parry Sound Muskoka,
yes, that was a great example.
The Conservative candidate won re-election. Yeah. The Greens were just nipping at his heels, really close behind, and had a Liberal and New Democrat candidate not run in that riding, and had the Green candidate enjoyed the votes that went Liberal or NDP, they would have won.
And the Liberals got maybe 6% of the vote, and the NDP maybe 2%. It was.
And the Greens lost by 2.
Yeah, and
they lost by 2 points.
It's infuriating because why are you fielding candidates there? I know the Liberal candidate there because we spoke to people in the Riding Association. They didn't have a local person and wanting to run in Parry Sound Muskoka, and the leadership parachuted somebody in. Why are you having someone who doesn't have any connection there?
Well, first off, you've got to parachute somebody in because once the media publishes that you're not running a full slate, it communicates that you're not really running for government. Mm-hmm. Now, the theme of this show has been voter turnout. Mm-hmm. You're committed, your organization, if there's one thing that brings it together is to get rid of Doug Ford. Let me suggest where you might want to put your strategy.
Sure.
Which is in pushing for electoral reform.
Yep.
Had we had a ranked ballot, the outcome that you like would more likely have happened.
I absolutely agree.
And so, and you noted that the Liberal Party is the party that made the biggest gain. I was wrong. I thought that the Liberals were going to displace the NDP as the second party based on the polls because the NDP was dropping, Liberals are going up. That didn't happen.
Because they have an inefficient vote.
Yes. The Liberal vote is spread like butter on toast. The NDP vote is concentrated. Yes. It's a lump. And it's in the core of big cities like Toronto and Ottawa and London and so on. So the Liberals have more potential. The big threat now to the Liberals is that they could get squeezed out. If you look at all 4 provinces in Western Canada, the provincial Liberal parties aren't a factor anymore. They don't even compete. And this is now the 3rd election in a row that the Liberals have been the 3rd party. But the Liberal Party in Ontario hasn't supported electoral reform. We had a referendum on it a number of years ago, but the Liberal Party didn't speak in favor of it.
I'm going to just quickly clarify on behalf of Stephen Del Duca that in the last campaign, the election of 2022, the official policy of the Liberal Party was to have a ranked ballot without a referendum. They were just going to go right to a ranked ballot. And I agree with you. I support a ranked ballot. I suspect you do. We might have a bit of a, we could debate that in eternity. But I think, electoral reform is a tough one because it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think the position we take is that electoral reform will not happen unless, certainly Doug Ford is not going to support electoral reform. But if the parties were to unite and take over government one time as a temporary merger, then they could do things that would be unpopular to do as one party, such as institute some form of electoral reform. And I mean, people all over the internet are coming at me saying, "Oh, we need this form of electoral reform." That we don't propose to be electoral reform experts, but I mean, certainly if we could change the government and have a coalition of people who are trying to work for better, then that would be a great opportunity to institute something.
You know why it's never going to happen? I shouldn't say never. You know why it's not in the imminent future of this province? And Kareem, you know this better than anybody because you ran for office once upon a time, and your chief opponent in that election was the NDP. Okay, so Liberals and New Democrats hate each other more than they hate Conservatives.
Absolutely.
So they can't work together to get rid of Doug Ford because they don't like the other guy any more than they like Ford.
And we would like them to get over it because whatever happened, in 2018 or 1957 or whenever it was that started this bitter war, get over it because nobody in the province cares.
I think it happened two millennia ago when their DNA was formed. So I think it's a tribal enmity that will not be easily overcome.
But you've been here. This guy's been here, and I really want to tap into. You ran in Parkdale High Park, I think, a couple of elections ago.
2022. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Then you have a very good and deep understanding of how Liberals and New Democrats have a bigger problem sometimes with each other than they do with the progressive Conservatives. Yeah. So there's no prospect of them working together on this.
Liberals are a broad tent brokerage party that brings together different interests. NDP tend to be more aligned around one set of interests. As Nelson was saying, Liberals in particular will look at Ontario and say, of course we're going to run someone in Parry Sound, Muskoka, or in southwestern Ontario. If you look at the regional splits, actually, this time is quite interesting. The Liberals who are thought to be dead in southwestern Ontario, those numbers are starting to pick up a bit more. Any riding that looks unattainable, a couple elections later, can be in your favor. Yeah. And so Liberals who believe in, who have a positive vision for government in a way that's, maybe a bit different than the other parties because they aspire to govern, but they aspire to be quite reformist as well. They're always going to show up. What you don't have in Ontario, except with one actually example we haven't talked about yet, is what you see in other provinces, which is some of the other forms of realignment. Some Ontario Liberals actually tried to force a realignment by recruiting Mike Schreiner to run for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party. So that would have created a new dynamic, maybe along the lines that Sonal is talking about. That it would, part of the effect of that, if Mike Schreiner had won for the Ontario Liberal leadership and won, that would have been quite devastating for the Greens. You do see this in other provinces where you have leaders and parties realign. I think the voters will decide after a third progressive conservative majority term what kind of realignment they will be forcing. I think they'll be interested in organizations like Sonal's. But also, I think you're going to see this kind of, again, grassroots media. You're going to have more celebrities showing up and being engaged politically. Bobby Ann Brady is a local celebrity in Haldeman, Norfolk. To the extent that candidates can break through and create their own media interest, to the extent that parties can recruit people who are not conventional politicians and stand for them, I think that's very interesting. You're going to might see more TV personalities, more media influencers who are going to be candidates. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'm not sure. I just know that that's where people are getting their information are from these very distributed sources of information. And those people who are influential online could break through and could become
Can I just jump in quickly? There's no single unifying theory to improve voter turnout. But while we're on the question of splits, and Karim is right about, I think, celebrity, or what I would call high name recognition politicians. I think we would all agree, setting aside what anyone at home might think about Bonnie Crombie, she's a local celebrity in Mississauga. High name, high recognition, high profile. And yet she did not win her own seat.
Yeah.
But if the Greens and you Democrats had not been in that riding, she would have gone over the top because she was short by what? I think about 1,500 votes, plus or minus. And that's how many of the Greens and you Democrats took away. So that's the challenge we always face.
And Mike Schreiner has, and the Green Party has always been amenable to the idea of cooperating. The thing is you can't cooperate if there's no one to cooperate with.
Well, but Mike Schreiner would be in favor of that because he only has two and a half seats.
To his advantage.
So taking out a candidate in Thunder Bay is not a big sacrifice for him. No. At the end of the day, the opposition never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Sorry for borrowing that Middle Eastern aphorism, but that is the challenge. And when people talk about the Liberals being low in Ontario or in the Prairie provinces, the Liberal brand is not going to go away anytime soon in Ontario. And while their strength is in the cities of Ottawa and Toronto, and they're weak in other areas, it goes up and down. And the problem, the challenge that the NDP faces is that they have a ceiling. Barring 1990 Redux and Bob Rae, who cannot be replicated and is no longer a New Democrat, they seem to have a ceiling in the number of seats that they can win. They cannot easily form a government, and they had 3 chances in the last 3 elections when the Liberals were in the penalty box, right? So the stars were in alignment, they couldn't do it. So the Liberals, at some point, which is I think what your organization wants to do, you were telling us, to get rid of Doug Ford, I don't think the NDP is going to be able to do that. And the Liberals, at some point, are going to have to rebuild.
Yeah, I mean, the Liberals will rebuild and bounce back at some point. They've been too much of a force, but I mean, will it happen sooner or later? I mean, certainly they haven't done.
I mean, popular votes at 30%. Well, that's pretty significant.
That's right.
Well, it only took them 42 years to do it the first time.
Well, true, right. And you know, you're right that the NDP also has a ceiling. And I think the difficulty is the NDP doesn't seem to realize that they have a ceiling. They come out every time saying, well, we were the opposition, so we are positioned to lead, even though they're third in the polls. And when you come to voters with this, you know, it's like it doesn't make sense.
Nelson Wiseman.
Well, I agree completely. Yeah. The NDP recognizes it has a ceiling. The NDP is not running to form the government. It knows, but it has to say it is. The NDP, however, sees itself as a powerful force if it can hold the balance of power. And that's what it did when David Peterson was in power, when the Liberals were there. So that's what the NDP is angling for, in my opinion.
Right.
Can I ask you a question about, well, I'm just going to ask this directly. Many people believe that it was in the interests of the Conservative Party, in order to get reelected, to essentially suppress the vote. The fewer people that voted, the better for them. Do you think that's the case?
Yes. But what was surprising is that the turnout this time, I think, was 1% higher than last time.
It was.
And so what did that tell me? Were issues important? Well, people, I think, don't think their access to health care is going to immediately improve if another party gets in, or even if the Liberals and the NDP had cooperated. The big issue hanging over the election, although it's not within area's jurisdiction, with the province's jurisdiction, was the tariff threat. But the province has no say, really, in what happens at the border or in international trade or tariffs. That's decided by the federal government. And what was the differences among the parties on fighting Trump's tariffs? Was anybody saying we should go along? Nobody. So, that's an issue that hanged over the election. And Ford was very effective going down to Washington, using that footage in his ads. And he projected an image which I think really aided the Conservatives during this election campaign. If you go back to the last poll that looked at the approval rates for premiers, the last one I saw was December, Ford's was the lowest in the country. At the same time, his party was very popular. That's very, very unusual. Now, we haven't seen the most recent polls, but I bet Ford's numbers really went up. And one of the reasons is because he came across in some ways is more authentic, like,
Okay,
aw
let me-
shucks.
I think his Captain Canada cosplay sort of, was effective, but at the same time, I was reading an article in CBC Sudbury over the weekend, and like people were in the north, candidates were knocking on doors and they were talking to the people there, and they're saying, well, we want to vote conservative just because we think they're going to win, and if we don't have a conservative leader, we won't have a voice at the table. And I mean, I know that's not how it's supposed to work in government, but that's certainly how people are perceiving it to work. And I know the NDP are saying, well, yes, we're the opposition, we're going to hold the government to account, but you can't hold the government to account if they don't care.
Let me jump in here. We've got a couple of minutes to go, and I want to put these numbers to you, Kareem, and get your take on it. Doug Ford's party got 43% of the total votes cast. 45% of the eligible voters voted. So he got 43% of the 45%, which means Doug Ford has 100% of the power at Queen's Park on the strength of 19.35% of eligible voters. Do you find that problematic?
If people don't like that system, if people don't like that result, they have choices. And, when I ran, for instance, under this, as a candidate under this ranked ballot platform that the Ontario Liberals were championing. I think we have some really big problems with our democracy. And, there are ways that we can move things. Outside activists have a role. One of the issues we're really concerned about at the dais is the future of post-secondary education in Ontario. And I know Martin's been doing a lot of writing about this as well. We know this is one of the big policy failures of this government, combined with some of the issues of the federal government, that we have a really underfunded and not reformed post-secondary college and university system in Ontario. Well, yeah, you can vote on that. You can say, Conservatives didn't say enough about that, and here's the platform issues. But at some point, it's going to take some outside energy. It's going to take students, it's going to take parents, it's going to take activists to actually raise the issue. In all of this conversation, politicians are still politicians. They still follow sometimes public opinion. And if an issue is raised to a high enough degree, there is the potential to make change. This is what we just fundamentally believe at the dais. And I think that, the big change movements in history, some of them come to Ontario, and they can bring change.
Can I get 30 seconds from you on whether you think any government, regardless of party stripe, that wins with 19.35% of the eligible voters has a legitimacy problem?
Not at all. In our system, that's the way it works. As Kareem was arguing, those are the rules. People have the ability to change. To your earlier question, was this voter suppression? Not at all. In fact, this is not a repressive country. It is not a suppressive country. All you got to do is go down and vote, show your ID, and you can make a difference. You're only wasting your vote if you sit at home and let other people vote for you.
There you go. That's our time, everybody. Can I thank Martin Redcon from the Toronto Star and Sonal Champsey? Not One Seat is her organization's name. And on the other side of the table, Kareem Bardisi from the dais at Toronto Metropolitan University, and Nelson Wiseman, whose classes we all took so many years ago at the University of Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody. Good discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jason Dunkerley was born with a condition that has rendered him blind his entire life. And yet somehow he has managed to represent Canada at 5 Paralympic Games and numerous other international events as a runner. How he does that, not to mention negotiating the obstacles in the rest of his life, is the subject of his new memoir. It's called Visions of Hope, Running Towards My Own Truth. And it brings Jason Dunkerley to our studio tonight. It's great to meet you.
Thanks, Steve.
I enjoyed the book very much.
Thank you.
Let's deal with the vision issue right off the top, because you and 2 younger twin brothers all had this eye condition rendering you blind. So I have this right? You have never been able to see ever during the course of your life, right?
No, we were born blind and, grew up with blindness throughout, so it's never changed. It's always been, as it is constantly, no sight.
Is it easier to negotiate your way through this world having never been able to see versus having had sight and then losing it?
I think so. I think having sight and then losing your ability to see and have the points of references that come with eyesight would be very difficult. I know many people that have lost their eyesight, and I think it's, for them, I think it's been challenging, but for me, it's always been as it is, so I'm used to it, and I don't think you miss what you don't have, right?
Right. Okay. Let's go back and start to tell the story of your life, because even though you ran for Canada, you're not from here.
No.
You're from Northern Ireland
Right.
originally.
Yeah.
Did you, so let me ask you a political question right off the top. Did you have a view on how the Troubles should have ended in Northern Ireland?
Well, I mean, I think when you're there, and thinking back to growing up, of course we were aware of the Troubles, and everybody's on one side or the other, but life sort of moved forward day to day, and I don't think we really consciously necessarily thought a lot about it. But coming here, you realize, how precarious things were, and I think I can say now, I mean, what I think, how the ending I would really have liked to see and would like to see would be a peaceful one, where people can coexist and share the beautiful country that Northern Ireland is, and get along and look out for each other and support one another. I mean, that's really what I would hope for.
Your blindness was not the only thing you had to kind of make your way through and figure out during the course of your early life. You tell us in the book that your father abandoned you and the rest of the family. Do you know why?
Well, my father left when I was 7. My brothers were, they were 2.5 years younger than me. I was in the middle. My sister was 10. I think he probably just had some of his own struggles. He lost his taxi business that he had, and I think he had a gambling issue, and he struggled, and I think probably had a difficult time coping. And I think, it was really hard losing our dad. He left my mom, with a lot on her plate, raising all of us on her own. But I think as life kind of went along, I probably came to judge him less for that, and recognized that he probably did his best with the tools that he had. And, I'm grateful for the things I do remember about him. He taught me how to ride a bike, and, we played football, soccer with him, and those are memories that I, still hold dear.
Did you ever see him again after he left?
Never did. No, I never did. And he passed away about 1.5 years ago. So unfortunately, yeah, we never reconnected. Yeah.
Here's what you say in the book. Here's an excerpt. Sheldon, bring this up if you would. It was important to my mother that we grow up feeling independent and empowered to make our own choices. She wanted us to be able to stand on our own feet. Jason, how did she do that?
Well, I think she wanted us to be like any other kid, to go outside and play around in the area where we lived, in the neighborhood we lived in, to ride bikes, to fall off our bikes, and just have those kinds of experiences that every other kid really can relate to. And she wanted us to be able to think for ourselves and, operate autonomously in the world. And I think I tell this story in the book too. I have a friend, Neil McCulloch from elementary school, who came over to my house one day, and I had this radio, CB radio, kind of a two-way radio communication system, and Neil wanted to use it, and he asked my mom, can I use it? And she said, well, you have to ask Jason, and Neil, he told me about that later. He said, well, my parents would have just said yes, so, but yeah, my mom wanted us to be our own people.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
You moved to Canada in 1991.
Yes.
You're still a kid, and you write that you began running to silence the echoes of my homesickness. So in a way, do you owe your athletic prowess to the fact that you were a pretty lonely kid?
I think in a lot of ways it was, athletics and running was an outlet for me to turn to. I mean, it really probably was in many ways throughout even my adult life too. It maybe still is even. But I think at that time, leaving your home and everything that you're used to, I was 13. It's a time when young people are vulnerable. I certainly was, and I really struggled with the move that we made. And I think running gave me a focus and kind of a place to really put a lot of that sort of pent up emotion and try to sort of deal with that move and work through it, and it became a really positive thing in the end.
Were you bullied because of your visual impairment when you went to school?
When we were younger, my brothers and I, there were some kids in our neighborhood who would would sort of poke a bit of fun sometimes at us being blind. And there was even a kid that we went to school with, and I remember this, and I might have mentioned it in the book too. He could see more than we could, but he was still, legally blind. But he would kind of run up and sort of, tap us on the shoulder and then run away and say, well, you can't catch me. And one day I did, and I did catch him, and I kind of beat him up and got suspended. We each got suspended for a day. So
you did mention that in the book.
But there were a lot of other kids, even in our neighborhood growing up, who really sort of looked out for us, and I would say sort of formed this cloak of, protection or solidarity around us, and welcomed us into the circle that we had.
At what point did you realize, hey, you know what? I'm pretty good at this running thing. I could get really good at this.
Well, I think probably sort of a couple of years into high school, maybe grade 10 or grade 11, I had really a lot of support when it came to guide running at the school. I went to a school in high school. My brothers and I went to school in Brantford, the W. Ross McDonald School, for students who were blind, and the teachers there would guide us in cross country and track, and we also wrestled and did some different sports there too. But running was what I really loved to do, and there were one or two teachers in particular, Mr. Rawlings, Mr. Rattray, Mr. Howe. I mean, they're really just incredible human beings who really went way over and above in their jobs to just support and empower us to really be ambitious and just work hard, and they were there to guide us and support us. And I think just with that type of support and being in that environment, started to get a little better, and could do more, go longer. And then I think it's like a virtuous cycle where you're like, okay, that if I work even harder at this, I can get even better, and who knows what can happen then. So yeah, running is, I always say, running is individual sport, but when you've got people on your team like that, and especially running with guide runners, I mean, it's really got that team part to it too.
Well, indeed. Let's explain how this works, because if people haven't seen this before, the way you run a race is, well, you know what? We've got a clip here we're going to show. This is from London 2012 Paralympic Games, and people will see that you are tethered to a partner, and the partner is essentially your eyes for the race. Yeah. So we're going to take a look at that clip, then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
It's not like you just go down the block and find somebody who's a relatively fast runner and they can jump into this. These guys are world-class runners as well, and they have to be. Otherwise, they get dropped by their competitor.
So here we go, the 1,500 metres men's final for the T11 for visually impaired with guide runners.
So 3 3/4 laps.
Now, we're looking at a race right now where you and several of your competitors are tethered to their guide runners, and you are running around a track. And I mean, the first and obvious question is, how do you guys not crash into each other even more than you do?
Yeah, I mean, you spend a lot of time training together. So this race was with Josh Karanja. Josh himself, was a phenomenal runner who ran in the NCAA system and represented Canada at the Francophone Games, so very accomplished athlete. We started running together in 2011. We were coached by Josh's high school coach, who took me on as an athlete, Ian Clark. And so we just did a lot of work, over kind of that year leading into London 2012, to the point where, we're running together. And I mean, it's almost, I'm really almost not thinking even that there's somebody else tethered to me, the communication becomes really seamless, and it enables us to work really quickly and closely together, and we're not talking much to each other. So Josh is able to kind of manipulate where we are and move us in and out. And all the teams are like that. So there are collisions and things that happen, but I mean, by and large, the races go pretty smoothly.
I noticed some of the racers have glasses on. How come?
Well, all the blind racers are meant to wear glasses to ensure that no one can see. So there's a system of classification where people are tested by a medical ophthalmologist, a doctor who, looks in their eyes and tests to ensure that they, have no eyesight. But just to really make sure, the idea is that they would wear glasses just to eliminate any possibility of being able to see.
Because I guess if you had 5 or 10% vision, you're technically legally blind, but that's a big advantage over someone who can't see anything.
And there are categories where people have 5 or 10% vision, but when in the category I competed in, the T11 category, everybody is meant to run with a guide runner. That's how that category works. Yeah.
Okay, Jason, I got to ask you about this. You're going to remind me which race this is, because I can't remember right now. You lost a gold by 4/100ths of a second. Which race was that?
It was the Sydney 2000 Paralympics. It was the first Paralympics that I competed in. running with the guide runner Greg Daly. We ran together for 14 years. And we thought we could, we were new to the Paralympics, new to international running really. And we thought we could go to the front and just try to run away with the race. And we tried to do that. And we almost managed it.
Are you over it yet?
Well, it took a long time because, for a long time it felt like we had sort of lost the race, lost first place, and as opposed to kind of winning second. But yeah, I would say I'm over it now. But it was a process for sure. Yeah.
Jason, I'm going to do another hard turn here because not only have you had the challenge of visual impairment to deal with and your father abandoning you, but you have had more tragedy in your life, and you talk about it in the book, and I want to raise it with you now. Mm-hmm. One of your twin brothers, Chris, was lost to suicide 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you yet have a full understanding of why that happened?
I don't know that I'll ever have a full understanding why it happened. I mean, Chris was my brother. John and Chris were twins. All of us were very active. My brothers were more active in wrestling, and they got involved in weightlifting, and Chris really took it to the extreme. He got involved in bodybuilding and competed as a bodybuilder, briefly in his early 20s. And something happened after a competition that he competed in 2002 where, he went through a bit of a low spell, I would say. Today we would probably call it more of a depression, but back then I don't think people were talking about depression as much or mental health as much. And we all thought he would sort of come through it, and it seemed that he had, around Christmas of that year. And then he returned he was going to Fanshawe College. He went back to school, Fanshawe, January 2023. I remember it seemed like he was fine. As brothers are, though, we weren't super close. We didn't check in on each other regularly. And, the next thing was end of January, got a message from my mum saying I should come home right away. And I was in Guelph. I took a taxi home in the evening, and, basically the police had been to our house to tell my parents that what had happened with Chris. And so we never understand really the full extent of the I guess the depths that he got to, but it's obviously it's very painful still to this day. And actually the anniversary of Chris passing away was just January 31st, so it's I think about that every day, but certainly every year as the years pass.
There was another shocking incident in your life as well, and I'm going to read the excerpt from your book which describes it. You're in Ottawa. You are waiting to cross Colonel By Drive. Mm-hmm. It's raining. You and a friend start to cross the street, and here's what happens next. Sheldon, bring this graphic up if you would, and I'll read along. We started to jog across, but then Stu spotted an oncoming car racing towards us from the right. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion after that. There was no good decision to be made. There was no going forward and no going back. I heard Stu yelling, "Jay, we're going to get hit." I've often wondered why we didn't try to run for it, but I imagine Stu assumed we would never have made it. We stood there on the line in the middle of the road and braced ourselves as the car hurtled towards us at 70 kilometers an hour. We had turned our backs to the oncoming vehicle, and this is how we took the crushing impact of the SUV. Jason, what happened next?
What I remember following that was what felt like a very long time just suspended in the air. And I think I remember thinking, where's the ground? It felt like this really long time just sort of hanging and hanging and hanging. And I actually don't remember hitting the ground, but I remember lying on the ground, and Stuart, my friend, also part of the national para-athletics team for many years, was thrown. We were both thrown. Stuart landed on the grass, and I landed on the road underneath an oncoming car, which stopped. And there were people around us. Sort of, I think the person who stopped in the car had some blankets that they put over top of us, and called an ambulance. And I was very sort of dazed. I couldn't really remember the date. I think I was able to kind of work backwards. It was November 6th of 2005. So I figured that out eventually. I didn't really know where our prime minister was for a while, but things came back slowly. But I didn't know. They told me not to try to get up.
Did you think you were going to die?
Well, when the ambulance came, I remember asking the driver, am I going to make it? And he said, yes, you will, you know. And I think I kind of wondered, do they say that anyway, or, you know? But they took us into the hospital, and, you know, Stuart and I were in the hospital for 6 days. Spent a couple of days in intensive care. I had a hairline fracture of the tibia, but I had a skull fracture, which was, I think, the more concerning thing for me. But, you know, fortunately recovered from that. It took time. Stuart's injury was a bit more complicated with his leg. He had a compound fracture of his tibia fibula, so that led to, you know, several surgeries for Stuart. And you know, we both got back to running, but for Stuart it wasn't. He never quite got back to where he was because of the nature of his injury.
A couple of follow-ups. I see a bit of a scar over your right eye.
Yes.
Is that from the accident?
Exactly, yeah.
It is,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Second thing is, and you just referenced this, you competed again internationally after this.
Yes.
How in heaven's name did you do that?
Well, I think I was very lucky, honestly, and I had really good sort of physio and really good coaching too from Ray Allard, the coach I had at that time with the Ottawa Lions Track and Field Club, where, you know, we really just took things very slowly and didn't do much, definitely by the kind of the standards of the typical training we would do, but it enabled me over a period of sort of 9 months to slowly come back in 2006 you know, running with Greg Daly again, go to the World Championships, and actually, you know, we won the 1500 and we won the 800, both kind of tactical races. I think different types of races would have been, if it had been faster, it would have been much harder for us. But that was really then the impetus for me to really say to myself, you know, I want to really put everything I can into training. And really, I think the year following 2007 was probably the best year we had, you know, in over my running years.
It's like there's this old expression on the radio, the hits just keep on coming, and with you, that seems to be the case too. I'm going to ask you a weird question here. You ready?
Sure.
How many kidneys do you have?
I have one.
And where's the other one?
So I donated a kidney to my ex-wife Colleen in 2013. She was diagnosed with they call it progressive renal insufficiency in 2008. Actually, it happened when we were in Beijing, when Colleen came over to watch the Paralympics, and she got really sick on the way over, and that's when they first started talking about kind of kidney failure. And Colleen was able to continue with her kidneys for really 5 years, you know, through diet, and she was being followed closely. But with the condition she had, I mean, it was an inevitability that sooner or later she would you know, be a candidate for a transplant. So in 2012, when it got to the point where, you know, it was looking more likely that she would need it sooner, you know, in the near future, I was tested. I was good enough as a match. I wasn't perfect, but with the anti-rejection medication, it was such that I could be a donor. So I was able to donate a kidney. And I mean, you know, you go through kind of the post-operation recovery. But very quickly, you know, I would say really within kind of 6 months to a year, we were through it. We were both thriving, and I mean, I don't even really think about it at all today. And Colleen is doing very well herself. You know, 11, 12 years later, the kidneys keeping her healthy. So I'm really happy about that.
Good for you. Your mother, who was the hero of your life, died quite young. She was 64 years old.
Yes.
And her last words to you were, "Jason, everything will be okay." What did that mean to you when she said that?
You know, it's been a message that I've turned to many times since. I think, I mean, so many things happen in life that cause us to sort of panic and throw us off, take us away from maybe the things that are maybe more simple and profound and important. And I think that day when she said it to me, I was trying to encourage her not to give up and to try to, you know, my mom had a very rapid cancer that really caused her to you know, really decline quickly, and we were trying to sort of encourage her to stay motivated and not to throw in kind of the towel. But it was at a point where my mother only had really a couple of days to live, and so when she said that everything will be okay, I mean, it's just been a message that I've really just tried to internalize in difficult situations since, you know, and and just remind myself that you know, at an elemental level, everything will be okay. You know, despite the anxieties or fears or different feelings that, you know, can derail us.
Jason, I have one last question for you, and it is a bit of an odd question, so I give you the heads up on that.
Okay.
If, through some kind of miraculous scientific advancement, you were somehow able to gain your sight, what is the first thing you'd like to know what it looks like?
Well, you did warn me. I would love to know what the sky looks like. I'd like to know what the people in my life who I love look like. Yeah, I think a lot of simple things, just simple flowers, you know, trees. Yeah, nature. I'd start there.
Now, I thought you might say yourself. Do you know what you look like?
I think I know enough, including the gray hair.
You do have a little bit of gray hair, I have to say. Yes, that's true. That is true. Well, I can't tell you how grateful we are that you made the trek from Ottawa to come to our studio today and talk about your book, Visions of Hope, Running Towards My Own Truth. Jason Dunkerley, a great pleasure to meet you, and keep on keeping on.
Pleasure, Steve. Thank you so much for having me here.
And that is the agenda for Monday, March the 3rd, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, with Pope Francis in poor health, we look at what's next for the world's nearly 1.5 billion Catholics. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.